Well, welcome to Andersonville. We've got Jarrett and Andrew with us today. Say hi, guys.
Hey.
They met up with me today, and we're going to take some time to tour the prison site. The prison on this site, which is officially known as Camp Sumter, but the locals and the prisoners knew it as Andersonville based on the town that was local here. It opened to prisoners the last week of February in 1864. And there's a reason why this prison was needed. What happened was that in 1863, negotiations for prisoner exchanges broke down for a number of reasons. Ulysses S. Grant is taking command of the Army, and the Confederates had issued a proclamation, which, if you've seen the movie Glory, you're familiar with. The proclamation said that any black soldiers in the newly formed colored regiments that were captured in Union uniforms would be summarily executed, as well as any white officers in charge of black troops. And so that was one of the reasons why prisoner exchanges stopped, because Grant insisted that until black and white soldiers were treated equally, he was not going to exchange any more prisoners. And so in late 1863 and the early part of 1864, the number of prisoners in Union and Confederate prison camps just ballooned beyond belief. Camp Sumter here was built to hold about 8,000 prisoners originally. The original site was about 16 acres. Eventually it was expanded to be 26 acres. And at its height, there were 31,000 men in July of 1864 held in this place that you see behind me. So we're going to take a look around, and we'll talk a little more about what went on here and just give you a good look at this place that has come to be known as Andersonville. Men arrived by train as prisoners at Andersonville. They would arrive at the train station nearby. They would walk. You see the path behind me. That was the path they would take. And then just imagine it going further through those woods. Eventually they arrived here at this gate. This was the north gate. And this was the main gate that prisoners entered once the prison had been expanded. They would enter through this outer gate and then into the inner gate. There were actually two sets of walls around the prison. And then there was the dead line. So you had the dead line, the inner wall, and then an outer wall. And of course, in between those two walls was where the Confederate soldiers would be able to go, and they would access their pigeon roosts. When men arrived through these gates, you could imagine what that must have been like. The sights they would have seen, the smells, the sounds. Imagine arriving here in the summer of 1864 when the camp was at its peak capacity. By that point, men were starving. You would have seen scenes that would be reminiscent of what you see in video from the liberation of concentration camps in Europe. Emaciated men, just skin and bones. And imagine walking into that as a healthy man, freshly captured, what that must do to your psyche, what that must do to you to realize that that is the fate that you have to look forward to. It must have been awful, but it was worse, because when fresh fish, as they were called, arrived, very quickly they had to deal with the raiders. Let's talk about them. So much of what we know about what went on here at Andersonville comes from the diary of a prisoner by the name of John Ransom, who kept a very detailed account of day-to-day life in the prison, descriptions of what the guards were doing, things of that nature. And one of the things that he tells us is that very early on there was a social hierarchy that developed. Men would, for the sake of morale and for the sake of order, camp within men from the same unit or same state. They made sure to keep their ranks, and so the sergeants, who would have been the highest ranking officers, or the highest ranking men here, because this was a enlisted man's prison, the officers went elsewhere to places like Libby Prison in Richmond. So the sergeants and the corporals would keep order the best they could, but very early on it became apparent that some people weren't interested in order. They became known as the Raiders. And depending on which account you believe, there was anywhere from 50 to 500 of these men that were in this gang called the Raiders. Most legit estimates put the number somewhere probably around 100. The Raiders would gather in one section, usually in a good section of the camp, and that was where they lived, and they were very exclusive. They didn't allow people to be apart unless they were willing to do the things they did. And what the Raiders would do is that when new men entered the prison, fresh fish as they called them, they would send a couple of the Raiders to go and befriend the men. They would tell them, hey, welcome to Andersonville. Let me show you the ropes. Let me tell you what's going on. Let me show you the best place to go in camp where you want to stay. You don't want to be here, you want to be up here. And what they would do is they would lead the men right into a trap where the Raiders, using makeshift weapons, would attack, steal anything of any value that they had on them. And this went on for several months until one day, one particular soldier was robbed of, I think, $170, which is a lot of money. That's like a year's worth of pay for a private in the Union Army. He immediately went to the guards and demanded to see Captain Wirz and tell him what was going on. Well, he was able to get through to Captain Wirz, and a group of men known as the Regulators were formed. And they were given permission by Captain Wirz to round up the Raiders, to organize a trial, and to decide punishment up to and including death by hanging. Eventually, dozens of men were sentenced to various things such as running the gauntlet, just little things like that where they would just run through and everybody would get a chance to beat them, to 6 men who were actually executed by hanging. It was a great account of all of that, not only in John Ransom's diary but also in the TNT miniseries Andersonville, which shows everything that happened with the Raiders. That was July of 1864 when the Raiders were hanged. After that, the Regulators were able to keep things pretty well under control, and there weren't further major issues like that. This is one of the reconstructed parts of the wall. You can see the original outer wall, which I think was 15 feet high. And then here, this fence that, it's actually a little closer here, but in most places you'll see it's about 19 feet. This was known as the deadline. And the deadline was the thing that you were not allowed to pass or even touch. Because if you even touched the deadline or in any way crossed it, then the Confederate soldiers that were up in the towers that were known as pigeon roosts would shoot you dead. And some men found out the hard way. Some men actually did it on purpose as a way of ending their own lives because of the suffering that they were experiencing. Obviously, when you're here, you kind of have to use your imagination to imagine what it would have looked like in 1864, 1865. But one really cool thing that they've done is throughout the entire site of the camp, they have 2 sets of stakes. One which shows you where the inner wall or the stockade would have been, and you can kind of line it up and see that. And then the second one shows you where the deadline was. And so no matter where you are in the camp, you always kind of have that perspective of understanding exactly where the walls would have been at the time. So the area that you see behind me was actually the both the source of water, but also the latrine. And you can imagine how that went. The reason that this site was chosen for Camp Sumter is because of three reasons, really. Number one, because it was out of the way and in a place where the Union Army was not likely to go, and therefore rescue the prisoners. Another reason was its proximity to the railroad, which is just maybe a quarter mile or so west of here. And then the third reason was that it had a natural water supply. Well, of course, you can imagine the results of men using the same water supply for drinking water and also latrine. They started trying to dig wells in different places, and you can actually see spots throughout the prison camp site where they had dug wells. But something happened in August of 1864 that most of the men who were here swore was an act of God, and so it became known as Providence Spring. There was a heavy rainstorm that day, and though you see a site here behind me that has water flowing, and we'll take a closer look in a minute, that's labeled as Providence Spring, it actually was a little bit higher up on the hill, about where I'm standing. And many of the men who were here said that they saw lightning strike this spot. Whether lightning struck this spot or not, what we do know is that at some point during that storm, water, fresh, clean water, began to gush up out of the ground. It burst out and sprayed the men who were nearby. And from that point on, they were able to get fresh water from that site. They actually would kind of come down this hill and hang cups there to catch the water, but eventually the guards actually allowed them to dig a trench over toward the camp a little closer, because this was actually inside the deadline. And so they had to be very careful of what they did. The original design for the camp was, the idea was that up that way, that would be upstream. So the water in the stream flowed in this direction. And so the idea was that the prisoners would get their drinking water upstream and then use the downstream area right here as their latrine. Well, there were two problems with that. Well, a couple of problems with that. One is that the guards had their quarters upstream of the camp, which means that they were getting their drinking water and using their latrines in water that then flowed to where the drinking water for the prisoners was supposed to be. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that they built the wall, the stockade, across the creek, which slowed the flow of fresh water into this area. And of course, it already wasn't fresh. And during the dry seasons, there was very little water flowing in, and so it basically just kind of became standing, stagnant water that was being used for latrines and had very little fresh water. And so, I mean, this was just a breeding ground for things like dysentery and the smells must have been just unbearable. The insects that must have been here, the disease, it just was all a nightmare. So we're up here now on the other corner of the prison, and you can actually see where they have an example of what the guards' pigeon roosts would have looked like. It said on one of the placards here that the people from the town of Andersonville would actually come out and go up into the pigeon roosts to stare at the prisoners. Hey kids, come on, we're going to a fun day. It'll be fun. Grab a picnic basket. We'll make a day out of it. We'll go stare at all the men that are made of skin and bones dying of dysentery. Apparently that was a fun day for them. Well, they didn't build any shelters for the prisoners here. Prisoners were on their own to do that. And so they ended up constructing whatever they could. They called them shebangs, and they would take whatever sticks they could gather or they were provided. They would put up a blanket or something for a little bit of shade. Sometimes they would dig into the ground to get down lower, to make some space for themselves to lie down in, but just one more of the many reasons why this place was so horrible. The living conditions were not very good. Almost as soon as men began arriving at Andersonville, men began dying at Andersonville. The first recorded death was in late February of 1864, and by the summer, at the height of disease and overcrowding in the camp, 100 men a day were dying in this place, on average. Sometimes it was more. Because so many were dying, there was very little that could be done to honor the men, to keep track of things. But a prisoner by the name of Dorrance Atwater was given the task of keeping track of the names of the men as they died, as they were buried, what units they were with, how they died. He secretly kept a second list for himself, fearing that the first list might not ever see the light of day. Well, he was right. And so, with the help of Clara Barton, he came back here at the end of the war, and they used that second list that he had, and they began to match it up with the graves. And so if you come here today, unlike most Civil War cemeteries, almost every name in the Union burials has a name. Almost every grave. It's quite an incredible feat that he was able to do that, and it's just like any national cemetery, it's a very somber place to be, especially today on Memorial Day. The very first soldier to die here at Andersonville was the week that it opened. His name was Adam Swarner, and he died on February 27th of 1864. The last man to die was a man by the name of Knut Hansen, who died late in 1865, and in between, nearly 13,000 Union soldiers died in this place. This is grave number 1, Adam Swarner, and you can see the flowers and the coins that people have left. And then the numbers go from this all the way up to very nearly 13,000. I want to tell a story about a soldier who died here. His name was Henderson Gearhart. He was 18 years old when he enlisted in Company F of the 39th Kentucky Mounted Infantry. Several of his brothers were in the Confederate Army. At least one of his brothers was in the Union Army. He was originally conscripted into the Confederate Army when they came to town, but he very quickly deserted, joined the Union Army, and fought bravely with the 39th for the better part of a year. In late June of 1863, he was on scout duty in Breathitt County, Kentucky, and he was captured by the Confederates. His records get a little sketchy after that, but it says that in September of 64, he was sent to Richmond to stand trial for desertion from the Confederate unit that he had very briefly been a part of. After that, there's nothing until at the very end of the war, his muster out sheet is a casualty sheet. No date, no cause of death. It simply says, said to have died at Andersonville. Henderson was probably 19 years old when he died here. He wasn't fortunate enough to be one of the men who has a marked grave. But where I'm sitting now is Section H. And all of the graves, all of the dead from the time that Henderson would have been here at Andersonville, which would have been fall and winter of 64, 65. All of the dead from that time are buried here. And so I found an unknown grave. This is grave 9802. I don't know which unknown grave Henderson's in. It could be any of the hundreds that are in this section, but this is the one that I've decided to pay my respects to. You're not forgotten, Henderson. So across the way from the Andersonville prison site is the Civil War Village. It's an RV and camping site, and in this village they have a pretty significant sized monument to Captain Henry Wirz. Heinrich Hartmann Wirz was born in Zurich, Switzerland. He had a family there in Switzerland, and at some point he, I think in the 1840s, when he was in his 20s, was sentenced to 4 years in prison because he had debts he could not repay. He was given, I think, an option, whether it was voluntary or not, that he could instead be banished from the country. Well, his wife refused to go along, so they got a divorce, but he first went to Russia and then came to the United States. Wirz had wanted to be a doctor, but he didn't have the funds to be able to get into medical school, so he worked as a physician's assistant in Kentucky for a number of years. When the Civil War broke out, he enlisted as a private. And according to him and his family, he was wounded severely in the arm at the Battle of Seven Pines, and that was why he lost the use of one of his arms. Other people have claimed that it actually took place while he was the head of Andersonville Prison, and he was on a mission to get some prison records or something, but we don't know for sure. What we do know is that he was promoted all the way to the rank of captain because of his bravery on the battlefield, and served in various staff positions. At one point, he was actually sent by Jefferson Davis to Europe with some secret papers that were to be delivered to the mission in London, I believe. Eventually he came back, and in the beginning of 1864, he was on the staff of General Winder, who was in charge of Confederate prisons. And he was then placed in charge as the commandant of Andersonville Prison. Long story short, at the end of the war, they're looking for scapegoats. They're looking for people to blame for what happened in Andersonville. Henry Wirz was put on trial. According to this monument, he was offered a pardon in exchange for incriminating Jefferson Davis in what happened, so that they could sentence Jefferson Davis for the war crimes. He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't take the pardon. He was sentenced to death for his role at Andersonville. Some of the evidence was pretty damning. Some of the other evidence was pretty sketchy. End result, though, is that he was one of 2 men who were hanged as a result of war crimes that they were said to have committed. The other one was a Confederate guerrilla, I believe. But he was hanged in Washington, D.C. in November of 1865, initially buried next to the Lincoln conspirators who were hanged in the same prison, but eventually moved elsewhere. That's Heinrich Hartmann Wirz. Well, as always, I'd like to give my closing thoughts on my time in Andersonville. Definitely worth your time. It was a powerful experience. I don't know if that's just because of my own personal family connections and my love for the Civil War, or if it would apply to everyone, but I certainly found it to be a really powerful experience to visit. I would say set aside 2 to 3 hours to do it right. Take the time to walk around the whole compound. Just kind of feel the presence of what happened there. It's a somber place. It's a difficult place when you think about what took place there, but I think it's important to visit. It's in rural southwest Georgia. It's kind of out of the way. There's not a lot around it. Nearby is Plains, Georgia, where Jimmy Carter was born. It's about 10 miles away from there. And then also there is the place that Charles Lindbergh took his first solo flight out of the airport nearby. So it's a couple other little things to see here and there. But I would highly recommend that you take the time to do it. Take the time to visit the National Cemetery. But for me now, I am on my way to the airport to catch a flight home. It was a great weekend. It was great today to be able to spend time with a couple of viewers from the channel and have them join me. Hopefully I'll get to meet you guys again sometime in the near future. Hopefully I get to meet many more of you in future events that we do. It's been a great weekend, but I'm tired. I'm ready to get back to my family. So let's head to Atlanta to the airport.